A key point I made in our last lecture is that the flow of energy in ecosystems is one way. Energy flows into the planet as sunlight, and it flows out of the planet as heat, which ultimately dissipates back into outer space. In between flowing into the planet and out of the planet, this energy is passed around ecosystems, moving from lower trophic levels to ever higher trophic levels as consumers eat producers. At each step, as we discussed, some energy is lost because of relatively low ecological efficiency of the energy transfer between trophic levels. Now, fortunately, at the time scale over which life exists, actually, or has existed so far, ecosystems can receive an essentially inexhaustible supply of energy, right? The sun isn't going to run out, at least not for a few billion years. So it's no problem that this energy is just moving in and then getting thrown away on the other side. But the other fundamental resources that living systems need, and by this I mean the chemical elements from which they're built, are not inexhaustible. These chemical elements exist in finite amounts on the planet. The total amount of the element nitrogen, for example, that exists on the Earth today is the total amount that's available. It's the total amount that ever was available, and it's the total that will ever be available for living organisms on the planet. But the problem here is that organisms use these elements in prodigious amounts. Consider carbon, for example. Carbon is an element that is incorporated into virtually every compound that makes up the structure of living things. By one estimate, about 170 billion tons of new organic material is produced on the planet each year by primary producers, the photosynthetic activity of plants mostly. And about 40% by weight of this 170 billion tons is simply carbon. This means that about 68 billion tons of carbon is being incorporated every year into new organic matter that's being produced. By the way, this carbon is being added one carbon atom at a time through that really important enzyme Rubisco that we talked about when we talked about the Calvin cycle. Now, so all of this carbon is being incorporated into the structure of living organisms. But at the same time, carbon is continually being lost from these living systems, ultimately by cellular respiration, when organisms break carbon compounds down, or by decomposition, when these organisms just die and rot. Now, if the carbon that got incorporated into living systems was discarded, we would soon run out of carbon. In fact, we would have run out of carbon long ago on the planet. So life on the planet depends on carbon being recycled into and out of ecosystems, or into and out of living things, and then back into living things. Now, while the carbon is not in a living thing, it has to reside somewhere else on the planet. Where carbon is residing when it's not in living systems, as well as how it gets into and out of living systems, is an important determinant of the structure of ecosystems. And this is going to be the subject of this lecture. In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention from energy to other resources. And by this I mean these elements or chemicals that we often refer to as nutrients that organisms need to build more of themselves. We want to look at how these resources or nutrients move through ecosystems. Again, our larger goal here is to understand how this pattern of movement tells us something about the structure of living systems, about the abundance and distribution of species. Now, the same point that I made about carbon is true of other elements. Elements such as nitrogen, or oxygen, or sulfur, or phosphorus, and so forth. These elements all exist in finite amounts on the planet. They're all used in very large amounts by organisms, and so they need to be recycled into and out of living systems. Thus, how these elements are stored, where they're stored outside of living systems, and the processes by which they get into and are taken out of living systems is really important in determining the structure and organization of living things in general. Now, because the movement and utilization of these nutrients involve both living organisms in the way they work and the physical component of ecosystems, we call the circulation of these nutrients biogeochemical cycles. They're called biogeochemical cycles because they're how these nutrients cycle through living systems, and it depends both on the biological component of the living systems that we're talking about and, as we'll see, on the geological features of the environment. So biogeochemical cycles. Now, different kinds of chemical elements, different kinds of nutrients have distinctive biogeochemical cycles. That is, they move through ecosystems, they move in and out of organisms in different ways. But before we look at the details of how different kinds of nutrients move in and out of organisms or living systems, I want to consider sort of what the general principles involved are, sort of a general model of what we need to think about when we're thinking about biogeochemical cycles. On a global scale, most of the nutrient elements that cycle into and out of living systems are actually found more abundantly in non-living reservoirs at any particular time than they are in organisms themselves. That is, most of the stuff that organisms are made of, ultimately the elements are occurring abundantly outside of living systems. There's some exceptions to that, as we'll see. Now, in general, the reservoirs where these nutrient elements occur are, as you might guess, simply the atmosphere, or bodies of water like oceans and lakes, or rocks. I mean, those are sort of the general components, or compartments, I should say, of the physical environment that can serve as reservoirs of these nutrient elements. Physical processes, such as, say, evaporation and precipitation, if we're talking about water, or the erosion of rocks, or the buildup of sediments, or even large-scale processes such as the uplifting of mountains over geological time, can move these elements around different parts of the non-living part of a biogeochemical cycle, or what we might call the abiotic part, or inorganic part of a biogeochemical cycle. Now, most nutrient elements that cycle through biogeochemical cycles are brought into living systems by the action of really just a couple of kinds of organisms. Plants, not surprisingly, as we've seen with carbon, and bacteria. Okay? Now, once these nutrients get taken in to living systems by the action of just a few players, then, just as we saw for energy moving through ecosystems, other organisms can take advantage of this, essentially by eating the organisms that have brought these nutrient elements into an ecosystem. So herbivores eat the plants that have sequestered nutrients, and in that way, herbivores are able to get these nutrients for their own survival and reproduction. Now, once a nutrient has entered the living part of an ecosystem, it can be recycled around that ecosystem repeatedly. In other words, we're talking about sort of physical storage components, compartments like oceans and rocks and atmosphere, performing sort of an abiotic reservoir of these nutrient elements. Once these nutrients get brought into living systems, they can stay near the living systems in ecosystems on a local or global scale for a long period of time before they get put back out into some inorganic physical form. For example, in a typical terrestrial ecosystem, nutrients are lost from plants and animals that simply die, right, and that decompose. Now, these nutrients can accumulate. They'll accumulate in the soil. In fact, that's what soil really is all about. Organic compounds that are built into sort of the structure of the surface. And these nutrient elements can build up, and then they can be taken back into living systems, again, largely by the actions of plants. So we have nutrient elements that are moving in and out of living systems and being stored in large inorganic reservoirs, and also these nutrient elements cycling within ecosystems, not getting too far away from the ecosystem, staying in an organic form, even if they're not living themselves. Now, or not in a living system specifically. Eventually, nutrients can be removed from a particular ecosystem, can be lost really from a particular ecosystem in a couple of ways. One way is if this nutrient is converted back into some inorganic or abiotic form that isn't readily accessible to the living organisms in an ecosystem, specifically plants or bacteria. Or nutrients might be taken out of a local ecosystem by physically being removed from that ecosystem. For example, nutrients that build up in the soil of a terrestrial ecosystem might be lost from that particular ecosystem by being washed out, by being leached away, and then the action of the water will move those nutrients somewhere else, no longer accessible to a particular ecosystem. Now, of course, if we're talking about biogeochemical cycles on a global scale, nutrients are never lost from the planet. They just get shuttled around from one place to another. Or they may be converted from forms that are more accessible or less accessible to living organisms. Now, one final general point to make concerns the rate at which nutrient elements move through biogeochemical cycles. The rate of movements of elements in different biogeochemical cycles can dramatically differ depending on the element, but in all cases, an important factor in determining this rate has to do with those decomposers we talked about in the last lecture. These organisms that are specialized in processing waste products and dead bodies of other organisms. Now, ultimately, nutrients, once brought into living systems, can be lost from those living systems when those living systems die. And this is where the decomposers come into play. The decomposers essentially will make those nutrients available potentially for other living organisms, especially other plants, to take them up again quickly. The question is, how fast can those decomposers do the job? And this depends a lot on abiotic aspects of the environment in which an ecosystem occurs. In a tropical rainforest, for example, the complete decomposition of a dead organism might occur in the matter of months or even less. It's hot, it's humid, and so the decomposers can work very fast. And as a result, you can have a complete or a very quick transition of these nutrients that are locked up in the dead body of an organism to a form that might be taken up by another organism. Let's contrast that, though, with, say, the cold, dry conditions of a northern tundra. A dead organism there may take years or even decades before it decomposes. So the rate at which nutrients are moving in and out of living systems in an ecosystem depends a lot on the rate at which decomposers can do their job. It's interesting that actually there's some funny consequences about that result from this. For example, the soils that you find in tropical rainforests are paradoxically relatively nutrient-free. Now, you might think a tropical rainforest, with the enormous productivity that it would be expected to have, would be a place where you would find an enormous amount of nutrients being produced as trees and other plants are living and dying. But the decomposers are working so efficiently in the tropics that these nutrients are quickly broken down and then taken back up into living systems as well. There's very little buildup of organic material in a tropical soil. On the other hand, in a temperate forest, you can have a very thick buildup of organic material, actually material that we call humus. Why? It's not because these temperate forests are more productive, it's because the decomposers are just doing their job more slowly. Okay, well, now that we've sort of looked at biogeochemical cycles from a general point of view, let's illustrate these general principles by taking a look at three specific examples of biogeochemical cycles, starting with the carbon cycle. Now, we've already actually learned a lot about how the carbon cycle works. We did this when we were talking about photosynthesis and respiration. Because when carbon is inside organisms, or the way that carbon works getting into organisms and leaving organisms is what photosynthesis and respiration is about. Photosynthesis takes inorganic carbon in the form of CO2, brings it into living systems through the action of the Calvin cycle, and then cellular respiration causes carbon to leave living systems as CO2 is lost as a waste product eventually of the Krebs cycle. Okay? Now the question is, what happens to all this carbon when it's outside living systems? We know that it's leaving through respiration in the form of CO2, but what happens to it? Well, when CO2 is produced by cellular respiration in a terrestrial ecosystem, it literally goes into the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is the major inorganic storage reservoir of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. Now, interestingly, in contrast to what I said about general models of biogeochemical cycles, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is fairly low. Actually, CO2 only makes up about 0.3%, or you might say 300 parts per million of our atmosphere. Now, this is because the demand for CO2 for photosynthesis is very high. By one estimate, photosynthetic organisms in terrestrial ecosystems across the globe remove fully 1/7 of all the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So, although CO2 is present only in low concentrations in the atmosphere, it's really only because it's recycling at a fairly high rate. As soon as the CO2 is lost to the atmosphere, it's likely to be brought into living systems again through photosynthesis. Now, there are 2 points to make about this relative to the global carbon cycle. One point is that actually a lot of carbon is tied up in organisms at any one point of time. This isn't very surprising because, as I said, organisms are largely made of carbon compounds. Okay? The second point to make is that the amount of CO2 that's removed from the atmosphere is generally approximately counterbalanced by the amount of CO2 that's returned to the atmosphere by respiration. There's a high turnover rate, there's a fairly low amount of CO2 stored in the atmosphere, and the inputs and the outputs to the atmosphere are generally balanced. There's an equilibrium. Now, there's an interesting point to make about this, which has to do with the fact that there's another major terrestrial reservoir of carbon that we haven't mentioned up to this point. And this reservoir are what we call fossil fuels. These are things like oil and natural gas and coal. Now, as I'm sure you know, these fossil fuels represent the undecomposed dead bodies of plants and animals that lived a long time ago. In fact, the fossil fuel reservoir is fairly enormous compared to the amount of carbon that's stored in the atmosphere. Estimates vary, of course, it's hard to know for sure, but estimates range from about 2.5 to 5 times the amount of carbon in the atmospheric reservoir is found in the fossil fuel reservoir buried in the earth. It's interesting to ask where all these fossil fuels came from. Now, when I was a kid, I was sort of thinking there must have just been a whole bunch of dinosaurs that all lived at once and just died out very rapidly. Well, maybe there were, but not enough to account for all the oil and coal we've got. Maybe the forest just grew very rapidly. Well, there's an interesting twist to that, and I want to tell you about it. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's kind of interesting. See, it turns out that the majority of the carbon that we use as fossil fuels today was deposited about 360 to 285 million years ago during a geological period that we refer to as the Carboniferous period. Now, the source of this carbon came from primitive trees and other plants that made up the first forests to arise on land after plants colonized land. Now, the interesting thing is ordinarily when a tree falls in the woods or another organism dies, its body is broken down by these decomposers we've talked about, okay? In the case of trees in particular, though, there's a kind of carbon that's particularly hard to break down, and this kind of carbon is found in compounds called lignins. Lignins make up much of the woody interior structure of modern trees. But evidence suggests that in these primitive trees, actually lignins were the primary structural support that allowed these trees to stand up. In other words, lignins were much, much more of a common component of these primitive trees than they are in modern trees. As I said, lignins are interesting because they're particularly hard to break down. It's a very stable kind of molecule. And in fact, in modern day communities, there are only a small number of organisms that have the enzymes necessary to do this. This is a group of mushrooms called the Basidiomycetes. And Basidiomycetes are primarily responsible for breaking down the lignin component of trees that have fallen. Well, interestingly, if you look at the fossil record, you find that this group of mushrooms didn't appear until about 60 million years after these primitive forests arose and dominated the surface of the Earth. So what this means is that there was a period of about 60 million years or so when an enormous amount of organic matter was produced in the form of lignins that couldn't be broken down, as far as we know, by any decomposers in that primitive ecosystem. And so these lignins were able to build up and are in fact thought to be the source, the major source of fossil fuel today. There's an interesting question that you might ask, and that is, what would happen if those mushrooms had arisen in the evolutionary record earlier? Would we not have all this fossil fuel that we are so dependent on? I don't know. The fact is that fossil fuels were deposited in the Carboniferous period, and over the last couple of hundred years, humans have figured out how to tap into these fossil fuels, to use them to produce energy for our own industrial activity, a point we're going to come back to later. As a result of this, what we have done over the last couple of hundred years is create a new source of carbon that is being added to the atmosphere. And so the carbon biogeochemical cycle is literally out of balance now, with more and more carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere. The significance of this point is something we're going to return to later. Now, there's another larger atmosphere of carbon that's found on the planet, and this is found in oceans. In fact, the amount of carbon that is found dissolved in oceans or stored in oceans is much, much larger than the amount in the atmosphere. In fact, it's thought to be about 50 times the size of the atmospheric reservoir. And the atmospheric reservoir and the ocean reservoir are connected through diffusion at the ocean surface. Some of the carbon in oceans actually is also deposited in an inorganic form that's not readily accessible to organisms. You see, in aquatic food webs, carbon is often incorporated into the shells or other hard parts of these marine organisms in the form of calcium carbonate. And when these organisms die, the calcium carbonate, their shells literally will settle out to the bottom of the ocean and form large deposits. These are deposits of carbon that are taken out immediately of the biogeochemical cycle of carbon, but nonetheless might act as a buffer for carbon. So an interesting question that biogeochemists are working on now is the extent to which the oceans will act as a buffer for the added carbon that's being added to the atmosphere, as the oceans can absorb this and use the calcium carbonate part of the ocean reservoir essentially as a chemical buffer. Again, we'll return to these kinds of issues later. Well, let's consider a second biogeochemical cycle briefly. This is the biogeochemical cycle of nitrogen, another key nutrient. Remember, nitrogen is a key component both of nucleic acids and proteins, and as we said, the amount of nitrogen available in a particular ecosystem can be a key factor in determining the productivity of that ecosystem. Now, as we saw for carbon, the biogeochemical cycle of nitrogen also has a major storage reservoir in the atmosphere. In fact, the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere is enormous. About 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. That's N2. The interesting thing about this nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is that it's not in a form that's readily accessible to be assimilated by plants or other organisms. In fact, N2 needs to be converted to other kinds of organic forms of nitrogen before plants can get access to them. And once again, there is a specific group of organisms that have evolved the enzymes that allow them to do this. These are the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which have the enzymes necessary to take inorganic nitrogen in the form of nitrogen gas, or N2, and convert it into ammonia, NH3. This ammonia, in turn, through either chemical or biological processes, can be turned into nitrates or ammonium, which are the forms that can be assimilated by plants. So here we have a biogeochemical cycle where, once again, the inorganic form, as with the carbon cycle, needs to have a particular class of organisms that get that inorganic form into an organic form that can be taken into living systems. In the case of the carbon cycle, we have green plants which are doing photosynthesis, and there are a huge number of green plants. In the case of the nitrogen cycle, we have a smaller number of organisms in terms of the number of species that can do this, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. But nonetheless, all of the nitrogen that we find in living systems has to come into those living systems through the action of these kinds of organisms. Most of these organisms, most of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in the soil. In some cases, actually, they have become involved in symbiotic relationships with particular kinds of plants. For example, leguminous plants, where the nitrogen-fixing bacteria actually will live in the roots of those plants and provide those plants more directly with organic nitrogen. Now, nitrogen can cycle in and out of this global biogeochemical cycle through the action of nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the one hand, and then there are a whole number of other kinds of bacteria, so-called denitrifying bacteria, which take organic forms of nitrogen, like ammonium, and actually convert that into nitrogen gas, and then it's lost to the inorganic part of the cycle. But there's also a local nitrogen cycle, because nitrogen will build up as a nutrient in soils by not being completely broken down into an inorganic form, but by being stored in an organic form, in the form of nitrates or ammonium that resides in the soil. So we really have two cycles here. We have a very strong local cycle as nitrogen is being taken in and out of living systems, but being stored in a form that can be taken up by plants easily. And then another global cycle where nitrogen goes back to an inorganic form and can only be brought back into the cycle on the biological side through the action of certain kinds of bacteria. Well, let's take a quick look at one more biogeochemical cycle to just look at some other contrasts we see in how these nutrient elements move around the globe. This is the cycle of phosphorus. Again, phosphorus is an essential element. It's found in nucleic acids, ATP, other energy-carrying molecules, or the phospholipids that make up our cell membranes. Like nitrogen, the amount of phosphorus in an ecosystem can often be an important factor in determining the productivity of that ecosystem. Not enough phosphorus, then the productivity goes down. Now, interestingly, at first glance, the phosphorus cycle looks simpler than what we saw for either carbon or nitrogen for two reasons. One reason is because phosphorus occurs in an inorganic form that can be directly assimilated by organisms. This is a form that we call phosphate. It's PO4, and it's actually usually a very negative ion form, so PO4 minus 3, just as a detail. Now, contrast this with the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Phosphate, in its inorganic form, can be directly taken up by plants. We don't need some intermediate. We don't need something analogous to carbon fixation that we see in photosynthesis or nitrogen fixation that's done by some bacteria. There's no need for a phosphate fixation step. It can move in and out of living systems more readily. Another thing that appears simpler about the phosphorus cycle is that there's no global atmospheric component to this. Phosphorus doesn't have a gaseous form. So phosphorus only moves in and out of living systems more locally, apparently. Phosphorus can be lost from a local ecosystem. Phosphorus can be leached out by water moving through that ecosystem, taken into some aquatic ecosystem where it'll eventually settle out and, in fact, form sedimentary rocks or get incorporated into sedimentary rocks. And then it's only available later on in geological history if those rocks are exposed through uplifting, and then the phosphorus is released by erosion and weathering of those rocks. So in a sense, we have kind of, again, two cycles, but these cycles are more distinguished by their time course. We have a local cycle of phosphorus, like we saw a local cycle of nitrogen, where phosphorus can move in and out of plants residing in the soils and being taken up. And then we have a global, or I should say a larger scale phosphorus cycle, which is not really distinguished by being global because it has an atmospheric component that spreads it around the globe, but really is more distinguished by being a long-term cycle because the phosphorus gets stored in rocks and can only be then brought into living systems through geological processes. Now, interestingly, recent research suggests that the phosphorus cycle might not be quite as simple as that description I gave you implies. And specifically, it seems as though there might actually be a much shorter term global cycle or component of a global cycle for phosphorus. So this evidence comes from the observation I made earlier that the soils of rainforests, tropical rainforests, often are very nutrient poor. It turns out that there's very little phosphorus in the Amazon basin in the soil. And yet we have a high level of productivity for the Amazon basin. The question is, where does the phosphorus necessary to sustain the productivity of the Amazon basin come from? And the answer seems to be that it comes from the atmosphere. And specifically, it comes in the form of phosphate-containing dust that is blown across the Atlantic Ocean by trade winds, by high atmosphere winds that literally are taking dust that's blown up from the Sahara Desert, which is rich in phosphate, blows it over the Atlantic Ocean, and it eventually settles out on the Amazon rainforest basin. What this means is that we have this unusual combination of global patterns of wind and the availability of a source of dust containing phosphorus that is what might be sustaining the structure and productivity of the Amazon rainforest. Well, a key take-home message of this lecture and the last is that energy flows through the biosphere while nutrients get cycled around the biosphere in interesting and different ways. And understanding these patterns of energy flow and nutrient cycle is an important additional dimension to our understanding of how we can explain the distribution and abundance of species. But even with this information, we can still only make very general predictions about the composition or structure of a biological community that we might find at any particular place on the planet. Next time, we're going to ask whether or not we can ever really fully predict the assemblage of species that we might find in any particular place.